you know what? And it's not my fault that people get on this platform and get comfortable, but I feel like too many of us are a little bit too comfortable, meaning we're too comfortable with the way things are. We don't tell the truth because we're worried about our bag and our check, and thinking if we all just spoke the truth, they couldn't cancel everybody. They can't stop everybody's check, but somehow there's always going to be some compliant ass person out there saying what people want them to hear, Van Jones, and then getting all of the money. And then we sit here and we wonder why we haven't moved forward, because somebody took a check and left us all out in the lurch. That's what happens. All right. You just triggered me just now with that, Tyler. But
obviously.
Yeah. No, I'm like, this COVID could be over. We don't have to be in this race war that we're in right now. The democracy that we are seeing crumble before our eyes doesn't have to be. If people would just tell the effing truth and stop people from gaslighting and call it out when we see it, there wouldn't be any Fox. We would gather up our family members and like, I'm canceling. You can't come to Thanksgiving if you keep with this bull crap. And that's it. Kicking you out the family. But too many people, Sarah, are benefiting from the current climate. Do you see that?
Yeah, it's enormously frustrating. We're dealing with, I think, unparalleled corruption in so many different aspects of American life, and they're all interconnected with financial corruption, systemic racism, a mafia state culture, climate change and denialism. All this stuff is just, facilitating a kind of climate where a very narrow segment of the population, a very wealthy elite, is having total impunity that eventually becomes immunity. And we're all supposed to just sit here and pretend that we don't notice this happening and have baseless faith in broken institutions, in broken people leading the broken institutions. And it's driving me nuts. Like, that's why the second book was called Hiding in Plain Sight, because this stuff actually isn't that hard to figure out. It's right there. We have a bunch of elite criminals who keep confessing to their crimes in public, and then everybody feigns, amnesia and pretends they don't know what's going on. And then with They Knew, it's about, a lot of the same people. It's like, they knew, we knew, everybody knew, and people pretend they don't know because they need to feign shock to avoid accountability. They want to avoid action. They want to avoid fixing the problems that people documented. And I don't know, it's frustrating, because what it does lead to, as y'all are just saying, is people refuse to even document the problems. They become reluctant to call them out. They want to conform. They don't want to make waves. They're worried about money, careers, things like that, at a time where democracy and our basic rights are in peril.
Hiding in Plain Sight, a history of the past 40 years of the decline of America. I've had several authors on talking about the decline of America. I think America, founded in genocide and enslavement and degradation of human life. I think it's hard for it to come back from that. That's the foundational edict of America. That's also part of the lie that we're living in, the myth making that we're living in, that foundation is cracked from the beginning. You don't just fix it with a little cement. Maybe the Constitution needs to be rewritten. Maybe we need to reimagine what a future America should look like, where everybody's participating in this thing called democracy. What are your thoughts, both of you, on this? Sarah first.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think you need to start at the beginning. And that's why there's been all this outrage and attempts to censor the kind of historical projects or just books in general that give that history of America from 1619, from enslaved people building this country, from Native American genocide, and all of these other topics that were traditionally glossed over in schools. We had a kind of awakening, a selective awakening, an awakening among white people, because I don't think that Black people needed to have the history of slavery explained to them, but apparently a lot of white people did. And then an enormous backlash, which is what we're currently in now. And, there are direct lines between all of these historic events. Trump didn't come out of nowhere. He was a culmination. He was a culmination of the kind of Reagan era policies I write about in Hiding in Plain Sight. But Reagan himself, of course, came out of a much larger tradition and purposely tried to reinvigorate it. From the moment he launched his campaign, it was based on white supremacy. It was based on this, facile view of trickle down economics that was really a war on the poor instead of a war on poverty. All of these things are a continuum. And now we're in this environment. I think people are understandably very traumatized by COVID. They're traumatized by the last 2 years. But what that's done to people, I think, is make them protective in a way that's really nefarious, where they want to just hold on to what's theirs. They feel like there's not enough to go around. Everyone feels like they're on shaking ground. They're looking for scapegoats. They're looking to demonize people who are suffering. And all of that concerns me a great deal.
I want to say, I think in the midst of all of this, and I've said this a million times, that there is a way to lean into hope. And oftentimes myself as a Black man in America, I do not have the privilege not to have hope. Sometimes hope is the only thing that I can hold on to. And in the midst of all the stuff that we walk through, and Sarah, I love how you just put the entirety of that together. I do think that I'm learning right now, especially with having a book out that continues to be read by lots of people, the power of our individual stories really matter. People ask me all the time, hey, what's something I can do in social justice immediately? And I'll say the first thing that you can do is begin to believe Black people when they tell you their stories. Believe Black people when they tell you something and know that it's true. I think the same way we can walk that same line in America by believing people's stories based on the actual things that they live, not their perceived idea of something or what they think they might know, but what is your current situation right now? Are you going to talk about how much you support Trump and this, that, or the other while you're in, and I'm not stereotyping anybody, but you're in Walmart trying to figure out, do I get the good oranges or the bad oranges, right? Like, let's really talk about what your current life is like. And if I listen to your story and you listen to mine, we can begin to walk through some of this effed upness that we're all a part of. So I'm aware that my take on it is very like on the ground, literal, but this is what I'm seeing right now. And it's all based out on what you said, Sarah. Like, I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really irritated me over the last few years is this line that we're always hearing from pundits and politicians, which is nobody saw this coming, meaning nobody saw Trump coming, no one saw the demise of democracy coming. Whereas in reality, the question to ask is, who are you calling no one? Who do you consider no one? Because people sometimes point to me and they'll think that I'm unique in having seen this coming. And I think I may be unique among white authors with a national platform, and that I was calling this out very early. Every marginalized group that was persecuted and targeted by Trump and by this broader band of racists and kleptocrats and other corrupt individuals saw this coming. Black Americans saw this coming, Latino Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, Muslims, Jewish people, everybody who was targeted saw this coming and said, take this seriously, please. Like, this is a serious thing. There is no American exceptionalism. Nothing is guaranteed. And then they just continue to feign shock. And at this point, it's malicious. And, so I'm standing with nobody. I count myself proudly among nobody. Nobody also includes all the scholars of authoritarianism who saw this coming in other places. We're like, wow, this looks very familiar here, this pathway to autocracy. So I don't know. That's the question that we need to ask, is who's considered nobody in this country and why?
We already know.
Believe us.
You already know. Sarah Kendzior is here. Tyler Merritt. His book is called I Take My Coffee Black. Her book, which is coming out, is called They Knew: How a Culture of Conspiracy Keeps America Complacent. So I have a couple of questions I always ask people who identify as white. Why do you do that?
Why do I identify as white?
Yeah, it's a made-up construct, right? And I feel like as long as we attach ourselves to a power structure that by its very nature was designed to keep people in bondage, to keep people in a lower class, then we are contributing to the very thing that we want to dismantle. So I'm committed to having everyone examine, what it means to be white in America. Most people can't even define it. So have you sat with it, Sarah?
Yeah, I think that that's a good question. I think, to deny whiteness, to feign some sort of color blindness, I think is destructive, because then you're denying the things that come with it. But to have it as a core function of identity is something more important than something else.
What's white culture?
Changes.
What is what?
White changes with history.
So how is that possible if it's an actual thing, right?
Because it's a caste of privilege. Like when my family, which is originally from Poland, came here, we were not white. We're in some weird ambiguous zone, between black and
immigrant.
white.
You were immigrant.
And Slavic and Eastern European and Catholic and weird. What happened was, it's very interesting. There's actually a story of this. I think it was in Detroit. Irish people Irish Americans, in an attempt to convince the Poles that they were white, because this whole sort of construct was a little bit foreign to Poles who thought about, other ethnic groups. There were lots of, prejudices, bigotry, but not in terms of black and white. It's an American thing. They put blackface on and then terrorized Polish neighborhoods so that Polish people could be taught to fear black people and to think of them as the enemy. And it kind of worked and kind of didn't, but I have to say, eventually it did. A lot of Polish people got on board the white train and decided it is safer, it is better, you get better jobs, you get to live in a better neighborhood. They wanted those advantages. They didn't want to be accountable for what they were taking or for what other people were being denied. And so when white people go on about you need to respect your ancestors, I always think of it in terms of like, yeah, I'd like to respect my ancestors, that they came here and other white people treated them like garbage. So it's therefore my obligation to not treat other people like garbage, to treat people who are in a worse place off than me. It's my obligation to change that, to make that better, and to raise my children right so that they don't do that. They don't perpetuate this system. Like it's about action more than sort of like stewing with my identity. It's about how you treat people. I think that's the best judgment of a person's character, is just how do they treat other people? Are they treating people with an open mind, hearing them out, and trying to actually make change, even if it puts their own security at risk at some points.
White people, listen up close. You come on the Karen Hunter show, she about to call you out and be like, why you white though?
They already know. They already know. And if they don't, they end up stumbling. Sarah actually gave the best answer. Everyone's like, it's hamina. Even the most erudite scholars come on with their, anti-racist books or whatever, get flustered when asked that, because most Americans have never asked themselves what it means, but they embrace it like it's lifeblood, and they will fight you. This is what we're fighting for right now. The preservation of whiteness. We're losing our numbers. They're going to replace us. But who's they? Who are you? And, if Italians were lumped in with Jews and blacks and dogs, and then they weren't. If the Irish were originally lumped in until they were like, hey, they're banning with the enslaved people. Let's break this up, even though they don't have any property, any rights either, but let's make them better so that they can stop this nonsense of coming together to fight the power structure. The 1%, it's still the same. It's still the same today. So everybody that weds themselves to this thing called whiteness is part of the problem, in my opinion. And I'm here to have that conversation, not just have a conversation, dismantle it. So who's the they in your book? Sarah Kendzior is here. She also has a podcast, Gaslit Nation. Sarah, you can follow her at Sarah, KEND, Z as in zebra, IOR on the Twitters. They knew. Who's they? And what did they know?
It's a lot of people. It's not like one they. It's not like one, evil cabal simultaneously, operating and organizing all world events. It's more the they of, people knew about corruption. They knew about climate change. They knew about coup plots. They knew about COVID. They knew about, racist discrimination. It's about everybody who is in a position of power and feigned ignorance in order to avoid tackling the problem. And also, instead of doing that, would label anybody who did bring up any of these serious structural issues that often led to mass death as conspiracy theorists, as alarmists, as hysterical, which is something like I get called all those things a lot. So I've been on the receiving end of this one.
Wait, did they just call women hysterical and institutionalize them when they had opinions in the 1920s and 30s?
Like uterus and hysteria have the same root word in Greek. Like it's an incredibly misogynist term. Sometimes I see it applied to men, but it's mostly if you say something that's true and that makes people uncomfortable, and that often involves a critique of powerful people, or even just a statement of these powerful people got together, had a plot, and carried out this grotesque action, people will think it's over the top. And you see it with things modern, conspiracies like the Jeffrey Epstein case. But I think one, maybe relevant for your listeners is the Tulsa 1921 Black Wall Street massacre, which when I would bring that up to people before it was more widely popularized through TV shows and also through, important historical work that's gotten more limelight, folks would think I was making this up. they would say if that really happened, like I would have heard about it. It would have been taught to me in school because that's obviously important. And so their instinct is to reject it. It's to say that couldn't possibly be true because I would know. And then the horror that comes to people when they realize that all these things were true and they were taking place right under your nose, and officials knew, and people in power could have stopped them, knew, and they kept silent. Like this idea that groups of powerful people cannot keep a secret is a myth. They will go to great lengths to keep those secrets. They're going to great lengths right now, trying to rewrite history books, trying to ban accurate history from schools. They will do that. And so it's important to call it out in real time and document not just what we know, but what we know they don't want us to know.
866-801-8255 is the number. Sarah is here, best-selling author, of course, co-host of Gaslit Nation, author of many books, including New York Times bestseller, and soon to be also Hiding in Plain Sight, and then They Knew. So you can pre-order that. We'll tweet out a link. Hiding in Plain Sight is a history of the past 40 years of American decline. How bad is it right now? And do you have hope that Humpty Dumpty can be put back together? In my opinion, maybe should just not. We shouldn't even try. Let's start something new, pouring a good, decent foundation.
Yeah, I think there's no way out but through, which is, you may have read like Stephen King's The Stand. There's a section about that, about how nobody really knows how to, trace this lonely and dark path of hell. He says something that sounds very dire, but then he says, you either come through it or you don't. And I actually find that inspiring, because when I think of hope, I think of resilience, and I think of defiance, and I think of perseverance, more than just wishes or dreaming or something like from the heart. It's about your action and your refusal to give up, like an insistence on, I'm going to keep going, even if I'm going out of spite, but hopefully I'm going out of love and compassion and something more noble. But that's also a motivator. I think things are very dire just because there's so many crises and they're interconnected, and some are literally existential, something like dealing with the effects of climate change, with extreme wealth hoarding, opportunity hoarding. It's a really tough time. And I feel for our young people in particular, who are kind of looking into the future and seeing dire things. And I hope they know older folks are standing up for them. I don't think of things though, like in terms of like hope or hopelessness, but just on like, what do we need to do? And part of what we need to do is be honest about the severity of the crises, because if we know what we're fighting, if we're real about that, then we have a much better chance of succeeding.
Sarah, do you, can I ask, what do you hope that, and if you could almost put it like into a sentence or two, that your readers are going to get from They Knew? I know when I sit down to write a book, I try to think about, when someone closes that book, what is it that I want them to stay with, to land on? And what's your hope that those that pick up They Knew, which all these folks that are listening are going to, because you're brilliant, we love you. Tell us, what do you want us to take?
I hope it makes people more comfortable asking uncomfortable questions in a public forum, because there's been so much stigma. There's been so many attacks on people for simply just asking questions. They're called tinfoil hat or conspiracy theorist or whatever. And that's meant to shut down critical inquiry on touchy subjects, especially in American history. And so I'm trying to remove that stigma. I'm trying to say, obviously, if you go in with malevolent intent, if you go in spreading propaganda like somebody like Alex Jones, like people like that do, that's a different kind of thing. If you're simply trying to get to the bottom of root causes of corruption in American society, of state crimes in American society, I think that's a good thing. I actually think that's part of civic obligation. So I'd like to remove the stigma from that. Like when I was a teenager in the 90s, I didn't feel like there was so much stigma to just asking questions. It was all over the place. It was in our pop culture. It was like on the X-Files. It was in, movies like JFK, for better or for worse. It was just part of our lives. Then after 9/11, I think things really changed, where to challenge these institutional bodies became viewed as unpatriotic. And I think it is an act of patriotism. It's an act of patriotism in the way James Baldwin wrote about patriotism, where you love America so much, you feel obligated to criticize it relentlessly. And I think that that's a positive thing to do. It's good for everybody.
Oh, you just trying to come on Black shows and drop X-Files and James Baldwin.
What?
We see you, girl. We see you.
Stop it. She does this everywhere. And this is not a Black show. 30% of our listeners happen to be melanemic. 30% are melanemic.
You know
to
I'm
quote,
playing. I'm playing.
I will
Sarah.
happily, I will do a spinoff that is just X-Files and James Baldwin anytime.
I love that.
So,
All right. Sarah Kendzior is here. How did you get radicalized?
I'm not sure I have been. There's some quote, I'm gonna botch it. I think it's from Orwell, where it's like, to tell the truth, in a sort of environment where nobody wants to hear it, it makes you like a radical by default. That is not the quote, I just butchered it, but you get the idea. Like,
Yes.
I become viewed that way just by simply stating the facts when I'm surrounded by a choir of liars.
You were raised in Connecticut. You went to similar schools that we did. I'm sure all of us, where we were miseducated, where you were not informed of things. Was there one seminal book? Was there one person, a teacher, somebody where you went down a rabbit hole and was like, everything I've been taught is a lie? Okay, let me explore. Wait a minute. Now I have to tell the truth. Was there that moment for you?
I don't think there was that moment. I mean, I was kind of like, born with a bad attitude. Like I never was really one to just kind of accept authority. I was, kind of a troublemaker, like a good student, but also a troublemaker. And I think with the internet, with suddenly being able to access all this information that I didn't have access to beforehand, in the 2000s and afterwards, at least in the initial period, that helped expand my mind. Every now and again, a book would come out that would expand my mind, like The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. Like, that blew my mind, not just for the content, but for the fact that I was never taught in school. And at that point, I was completing a PhD. And so you think, how do I get to this level? How do I live in St. Louis? How do I, live in a Black community and not know all of these details? And so once you're aware of how much you don't know, then you are, one, more curious about the world, but also more humbled. You look at everything and you think, well, what parts of the story have been left out? Why were they left out? Who left them out? That kind of thing. And I also, I spent the rest of my life studying authoritarian states. I was studying Uzbekistan, for over a decade before I had to switch to the US because it became so similar. And unfortunately, and Uzbekistan is a place where, you kind of got to give up your assumptions of what stands in for, normal governance and normal rule of law. Like, there is no such thing. It's constant deception, lies. You really have to wade through a lot of propaganda to gain basic understanding. And I started applying those same sort of, viewpoints and way of looking at the world to the United States, and found out a lot of interesting things. So not great things, but interesting things.
Of that, I read that you're fluent in Russian.
I'm not fluent. I think someone wrote that on Wikipedia.
Yeah.
I did study it, but it was mostly, it was for reading, because when you study a former Soviet country, all the literature from that period is in Russian. So I can read Russian decently. I speak it very, very poorly, especially, now that Google Translate has been created and kind of, broke up the whole fluency aspiration game.
Well, I'm fluent in Russian too, and we're about to have a conversation, but since you're not actually fluent, it's fine.
Hilarious. Tyler Merritt is here. He is, I think he is fluent in Russian. I think he speaks a lot of languages. Sarah Kendzior, as we watch this conflict play out between Russia and Ukraine, I know there's a lot more to it. You have a vast faction of Americans who side with the Russians because of their whiteness. You have some Americans who side with the Russians because they look at Ukraine as anti-Black because of what happened with the people trying to escape the war. There's a lot of interesting views. What is it that you absolutely know about this conflict, and how will it impact those of us who live in America?
Well, this conflict was instigated by the Kremlin. I mean, the first thing to know is, this conflict has been brewing for centuries, and Putin has declared himself a dictator and is trying to emulate the, dictators and czars of Russia's past. So he invaded Ukraine. And I think what a lot of Americans sometimes miss is he invaded Ukraine in 2014 and then took Crimea and then threatened to invade them for 8 years. And I know there's very understandable frustration with, like, why are the Ukrainians getting so much attention, money, aid, et cetera, from the American government when the American government has abandoned a great deal of its own people. And I think that that's a legitimate complaint. But the thing is, they also abandoned Ukraine for the first 8 years of this modern conflict.
And Georgia and Crimea.
Yeah, they've abandoned almost all the victims of Putin's Russia, including the United States, because, you know, Russia hacked us multiple times. They hacked like almost every agency during Obama's second term. You know, they threatened us, and they had an ally in Trump who was completely fine with this and on board and functioning as a Kremlin asset, which should be considered an enormously big deal, somehow has been memory holed by the current administration and by, you know, our quote unquote intelligence agencies, which leads me to believe that they are fine with it. And, you know, one of the things I emphasize in Hiding in Plain Sight and my other works is that this is not quite a government thing. This is a mafia thing. This is where the mafia and the government has merged, this group of oligarchs and plutocrats and real organized crime and state government officials. They are working in tandem for their own aims, completely uninterested in the will of the people anywhere. They don't care what Americans want. They don't care what Ukrainians want. They don't care what Russians want. Like, we're all, you know, there's a Ukrainian saying, you know, the people are the shit that the oligarchs grow their money in. And that's basically what's been happening, you know, for the last couple of decades. And so I hope folks, you know, feel empathy and solidarity with the victims of Putin's war, with the Ukrainians, you know, who are struggling to survive, and understand that this is it's a lopsided conflict. Like, they are being invaded and it's going on, and they are trying to drag it out.
See, you asked me, Karen, from the beginning why I feel Sarah, because she wakes up every day and chooses violence. She is telling it like it is, doesn't even care. Go, you tell him, girl, tell him.
Yeah,
866-80-8255. You know, Tyler and Sarah, I'm trying to be impeccable with my word, the 4 agreements. And part of that also is pristine with language. And I think we have allowed ourselves to, like, oh, I love you to death. Please don't do that. Love me to life. I need life, loving, affirming life. Choosing violence. No, she chose truth. No, they're not slaves. That something happened to them. They were human beings. Something had, like, we have to, in every step of the way, eliminate the N-word from everybody. No N-word. I don't care how it makes you feel at home and in comfort with one another, to be able to be in community around that word. It is rooted in destruction, and let's not do that. You know, and I feel like sometimes I'm going too far for the place that we're in, because people are like, just lighten up. But I feel like we've let too many things go. So, you know, Sarah's a Virgo, which, so I know she understands this. You know, there's a rigidness around justice with Virgos. Most Virgos, they have a due north and they're not moving from it. And I'm a Taurus, and people accuse us of being rigid in the same way. We're not. You just need to come with a whole lot of facts for us to change. But there should be a zero tolerance somewhere, I think, where we don't have that as a nation, most of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think precision in language, like you were saying, like, you know, people always get heated up about this. They think precision in language means cancel culture or self-censorship or something like that, instead of just trying to express yourself in the best way possible, you know, which is hard to do on the spot, you know, which is often why I prefer writing. But it's something to aspire to. It's a way of asserting your own control over this situation by defining it in your own terms, in your own experience, by not just reciting memes or letting an algorithm guide you. You know, that's another takeaway. You asked before about takeaways from They Knew. That's something else I really want people to do, is to, like, regain that sense of self that is trying to be drilled out of us in so many ways, by technocracies, by social media. There is such an impetus to conform, and sometimes it doesn't even come from human beings. It just comes from this sort of reward system of, you know, likes or retweets. Like, none of that stuff matters. It really doesn't matter. Like, human connection is what matters. Self-expression is what matters. Being comfortable with how you feel, your own moral integrity, your own moral core, that matters. And I think that reflects what you were just saying, Karen, about, you know, choosing carefully what kind of words we use, how we express ourselves, so that we live up to those values.